There is a particular kind of silence that settles over the Great Plains in the hours before dawn. Not the silence of peace or rest or safety. It is the silence of a landscape that does not care whether you live or die. The grass bends in the dark. The oxen stand still, their breath rising in small, pale clouds. And somewhere at the edge of camp, a man sits awake, alone, staring at a map that tells him almost nothing useful about the miles ahead. He was chosen because he seemed capable, because he had been west before, or said he had, because he spoke with confidence when others spoke with fear, because someone had to decide, and he was willing to. By the time his wagon train reached the Platte River, one family had already turned back. 2 oxen had died. The water barrels were half what they should have been, and the men who had elected him captain were beginning to hold quiet conversations just out of his hearing. Most of them would make it to Oregon or California. Most, but not all. And the failures, the graves marked with wooden boards that rotted within a decade, the wagons abandoned at the foot of mountain passes. The families that scattered and never reunited were not always the result of storms or disease or hostile encounters. They were often the result of something far quieter and far more instructive. They were the result of leadership that looked right, but was built on the wrong foundation entirely. What we know about wagon train travel in the mid-19th century tends to come filtered through a particular kind of mythology: the brave pioneers, the heroic guide, the triumph of westward ambition. It makes for satisfying stories. It does not make for accurate ones. The reality of overland emigration between 1840 and 1870 was considerably more complicated and considerably more human than the mythology suggests. These were not armies moving under military discipline. They were collections of strangers, farmers, merchants, craftsmen, former soldiers, failed businessmen, young couples with everything they owned packed into a single wagon, who had agreed more or less voluntarily to travel together for 6 months across terrain that even experienced mountain men approached with caution. They needed organization. They needed someone to make decisions when decisions could not be postponed. They needed, in a word, a leader. And so, at the beginning of nearly every journey, the emigrants gathered in a field or a clearing on the Missouri side of the river, and they voted. They elected a captain. It was a thoroughly American solution to a thoroughly American problem. Democratic, egalitarian, reasonable on the surface, and it contained built into its very structure the seeds of almost every major leadership failure that would follow. The election itself was often the first mistake, though few people recognized it as such at the time. What qualities made a man seem electable on the banks of the Missouri in the spring of 1848? He needed to appear competent. He needed to project calm. He needed to speak well in front of a group of anxious people who were about to risk everything on a journey most of them had never made. He needed, in other words, to be persuasive. But persuasiveness and sound judgment are not the same thing. They are not even closely related. A man who can calm a crowd in a moment of uncertainty is a valuable asset. A man who can accurately calculate how many days of grass remain between a party and the next reliable water source is a different kind of asset entirely. And the trail cared nothing at all for the first quality. It cared enormously about the second. The men who tended to be elected wagon train captains were, more often than not, men who seemed like leaders, physically imposing, frequently, confident in their speech, decisive in manner, willing to take responsibility. These are not worthless qualities, but they were routinely mistaken in those spring elections for qualities they did not actually guarantee: accurate knowledge of the terrain, sound logistical thinking, the patience to make slow decisions when slow decisions were correct, and the psychological steadiness to maintain authority during the particular kind of crisis that the trail produced, which was almost never sudden and dramatic, but slow, grinding, and relentless. The trail did not test men the way battles did. It tested them the way drought tests a farmer. Not in a single moment, but across 100 quiet mornings, each one slightly worse than the last. There is a journal entry that survives from a woman named Margaret Frink, who traveled overland to California in 1850. She was a sharp observer, and her account of the journey's early weeks contains a detail that, once noticed, is difficult to set aside. She describes her party's captain, a man chosen by popular vote in Independence, Missouri, as possessing, in her words, an air of great authority and experience. She notes that the men respected him, that he gave orders clearly, that he never seemed uncertain. She then records with the particular restraint of someone writing for posterity, rather than for the moment that within 3 weeks of departure, it became apparent that the captain's knowledge of the actual road was considerably less than his confidence had suggested. He did not know the distances between water sources with any precision. He had miscalculated the weight his own wagon could carry, a mistake that cost 2 animals before they reached the Platte. And when the party came to its first genuine crossroads, a fork in the trail where different choices had different consequences, he made his decision quickly and firmly. It was the wrong decision. The party lost 4 days. 4 days. In the context of an overland journey, where the timing of the mountain crossing could mean the difference between making it through before the first snows and not making it through at all, 4 days was not a minor thing. It was the kind of error that compounded quietly and visibly and revealed its full cost only much later, when the party was still struggling through the Sierra Nevada in October with provisions running short and animals too exhausted to be pushed harder. The captain never acknowledged the mistake. This too was characteristic. The refusal to acknowledge error was perhaps the single most consistent feature of wagon train leadership failures. It appeared again and again in the journals and diaries of ordinary emigrants, described with varying degrees of bitterness and resignation. The captain who blamed the terrain when his own miscalculation had caused the problem. The captain who blamed his scouts when the information they brought him was accurate and he had simply failed to use it correctly. The captain who blamed the weather,
ahead,
the livestock, the immigrants themselves, for outcomes that traced directly back to his own decisions.
Thank you.
This was not simple dishonesty in most cases. It was something more psychologically complex and more instructive. A wagon train captain operated under a particular kind of pressure that is worth understanding in some detail. He had been given authority by popular vote, which meant that his authority could be withdrawn by the same mechanism. Every significant mistake eroded his standing, not just as a leader, but as the particular kind of man that these emigrants had believed themselves to be selecting when they chose him. A confident, experienced, capable man, a man who knew what he was doing. To admit a mistake was therefore not merely to correct a course of action. It was to invite a fundamental reconsideration of whether the right man had been chosen at all. The captain understood this, whether he articulated it consciously or not, and so the mistakes were explained away, attributed elsewhere, minimized, or simply never discussed. The consequence was that the errors compounded. A decision that might have been corrected after 2 days became irreversible after 2 weeks, because correcting it would have required acknowledging it, and acknowledging it had already become psychologically impossible. This is not a 19th century problem. It is a human problem. But the wagon trail gave it a particular and unforgiving setting. The men who led wagon trains into genuine catastrophe, and there were enough of them to constitute a pattern, not merely a collection of individual tragedies, tended to share a specific constellation of characteristics that is worth examining with some care. They were almost never incompetent in any general sense. Incompetent men were rarely elected and rarely accepted positions of that kind of responsibility. The men who led their parties into disaster were, typically, capable in specific and demonstrable ways.
Up, Captain.
They could handle animals.
They
could shoot. They could navigate by stars in conditions that would have left most men helpless. They had experience, real experience, with the outdoors and with hardship. What they lacked, with a consistency that becomes striking across the historical record, was a specific and learnable set of capacities that do not announce themselves the way physical capability does. The first was proportional caution. The trail demanded a constant, ongoing calculation of risk, not the reflexive caution of a timid man, which paralyzed decision-making and cost time, not the recklessness of an overconfident one, which consumed resources and animals that could not be replaced. Something in between, something calibrated, something that was willing to push hard when conditions allowed, and willing to stop completely when they did not. Most of the captains who failed erred dramatically in one direction or the other. The reckless ones are better remembered because their failures were more dramatic, but the timid ones cost their parties just as dearly, in food, in time, in the grinding demoralization of a party that had been stopped by nothing worse than their leader's unwillingness to commit. The second capacity, rarer still, was the ability to use information from people who knew more than they did.
How will we
Every
get
wagon
over?
train carried or encountered individuals whose specific knowledge was more accurate and more useful than the captains in particular domains. The experienced mountain men who had made the crossing many times, the native guides whose understanding of water sources and weather patterns had been accumulated across generations, the emigrants themselves, some of whom had particular skills, veterinary knowledge, surveying experience, the ability to read terrain in ways that a general outdoorsman might not, a captain who could subordinate his own ego to this distributed intelligence, who could ask and listen and integrate what he heard into his decisions, had an enormous advantage over one who could not. The historical record is full of examples of both kinds. The journals of emigrants who traveled with James Clyman, one of the more respected guides of the overland period, return again and again to a specific quality. He asked questions. He asked the men in his party what they had observed. He asked Native Americans they encountered about conditions ahead. He asked merchants at trading posts what had come through in the past few weeks. He was not humble in any soft or self-deprecating sense. He was simply convinced, from long experience, that the information he needed was rarely concentrated entirely in his own head, and that finding it required a kind of systematic attention to other people's knowledge. This was not common. It was, in fact, quite rare, and its rarity was itself instructive, because the men who most needed this quality, the ones who were most confidently certain of their own judgment, were the ones least likely to seek out or accept information that contradicted it. There is a particular kind of crisis that the overland trail produced with notable regularity, and the captain's response to it was often the clearest indicator of whether the party would arrive intact or not. It was not the sudden crisis. The sudden crisis, the river crossing gone wrong, the unexpected storm, the medical emergency. These produced their own problems, but they also produced a clarity of action that many leaders were capable of rising to. There was something to respond to. There was a visible problem demanding a visible solution. The slow crisis was different. It developed over days and weeks. It was the gradual depletion of provisions that were supposed to last longer, the slow weakening of the oxen that the captain was choosing not to see because seeing it would require admitting that the pace was wrong, the fraying of social cohesion in the party, the forming of factions, the growing resentment that spread through a group of people who had been living in close proximity under stress for months. The slow crisis required the captain to act before the consequences were fully visible, to make difficult decisions, slowing down, redistributing supplies, acknowledging that the original plan was no longer workable, at a point when making those decisions still felt optional, still felt like unnecessary pessimism, still felt like an admission of failure. The captains who made those decisions early, and made them accurately, led their parties through. The ones who waited until the slow crisis became an obvious and acute emergency frequently found that the moment for effective action had already passed. They were making the right decisions, finally, in circumstances where the right decisions could no longer produce the right outcomes. This was, perhaps, the most instructive failure pattern in the entire history of overland emigration. Not the dramatic wrong turn, not the confident incompetence, but the refusal to act on early, accurate, uncomfortable information, the willingness to wait for certainty before moving, in a context where waiting for certainty meant waiting too long. The winter of 1846 placed all of these patterns in a light so harsh and so final that they have never quite faded from the historical record. The Donner Party is not a story of unusual bad luck. It is not primarily a story of early snows, though early snows played their role. It is a story of leadership decisions made at junctions where different choices were available, and where the choices made were consistently the wrong ones, for reasons that were entirely predictable and that were, in several cases, predicted. James Reed and George Donner were not unintelligent men. They were not incompetent men in the ordinary sense. They had resources, motivation, and a genuine desire to get their families safely to California. What they lacked was the capacity to accurately weigh information that contradicted their preferences, to adjust their timeline to the actual conditions they were facing, rather than the conditions they had planned for, and to recognize at several specific moments that the decisive factor was time, not skill, not resources, not willpower, but simply the calendar, and that the calendar was not waiting for them to feel ready. There was a man named Lansford Hastings who bears a particular responsibility in what happened. He had written a guidebook promoting a shortcut, the Hastings Cutoff, that he had not himself traveled with a wagon train. He believed it was feasible. He was wrong. and the Donner Party, partly on the strength of his advocacy, chose to take it. Here is what is most instructive about that decision. They were warned. An experienced mountaineer named James Clyman, who had just come through the Hastings cutoff going east, met the Donner Party going west, and told James Reed directly that the route was not suitable for wagons. He was specific. He was credible. He had just done it. Reed thanked him, considered his advice, and chose to proceed anyway. He chose to believe Hastings, whom he had never met, over Clyman, who was standing in front of him, because Hastings told him what he wanted to hear, and Clyman told him what was true. The party entered the Sierra Nevada weeks behind the schedule that might have gotten them through. The rest is history, and it is not a history that needs its horrors elaborated. The lesson is in the decision, made in a sunny Utah valley with the mountains still a comfortable distance away, to choose comfortable information over accurate information. Not every failure was on this scale. Most were quieter. A party that arrived 2 months late and spent a first California winter in conditions harder than they had expected. A family that reached its destination with half its livestock dead and provisions exhausted, dependent on the charity of strangers in a way they had never anticipated. A man who had promised his wife safety and prosperity, who delivered her to Oregon alive but diminished, who watched her look at the land they had traveled so far for and understood for the first time what his decisions had actually cost. These quieter failures are in many ways more instructive than the dramatic ones, because they show the ordinary mechanism of leadership breakdown without the distorting drama of catastrophe. They show the pattern in its everyday form. The most consistent element in these ordinary failures was not miscalculation of distance or weather. It was the management or mismanagement of the party itself. A wagon train was a community in motion. It had all the social complexity of a small town, compressed into a space roughly 300 yards long, moving through conditions of physical hardship and psychological stress that most of its members had never experienced before. It contained people who disliked each other, people who disagreed about priorities, people who were afraid and expressed that fear as anger, people who had made financial sacrifices to be there and were furious that things were not going as planned, people who were sick, people who were grieving, people who had left everything they knew and were beginning somewhere around the Kansas-Nebraska border to wonder whether that had been wise. A captain who understood this, who saw the management of human psychology within the party as a core leadership task rather than a distraction from the real work, had an enormous advantage, not because group harmony was pleasant, though it was, but because a disintegrating party made worse decisions, moved slower, cared for its animals less attentively, and was less capable of the collective action that critical moments required. The captains who failed to understand this, who treated the social fiction of their parties as something to be suppressed or ignored rather than managed, paid for that misunderstanding in ways that were sometimes literally fatal. There was a man named William I.D. who crossed overland to California in 1845 and who left behind a set of observations about the leadership of wagon trains that is worth examining with some care. He was not himself a particularly successful leader in conventional terms, but he was an unusually perceptive observer, and what he observed has a quality of analysis that was uncommon for his time and his context. He wrote about what he called the problem of the distance between decision and consequence. On the trail, he noted, the captain made decisions whose consequences arrived days or weeks later. A decision about pace, a decision about water conservation, a decision about which route to take at a fork in the trail. These did not announce their rightness or wrongness immediately. They revealed themselves slowly across days of travel, in conditions that had changed, in a context where it was genuinely difficult to trace a present problem back to a past decision. This delay, Ide observed, created a particular kind of confusion in the minds of both leaders and followers. The captain could not clearly see the relationship between what he had decided and what was now happening. The immigrants could not clearly assign responsibility for their present difficulties. Everyone was managing a situation whose origins were obscure, making new decisions in the hope of addressing problems whose causes they did not fully understand. The captains who navigated this most successfully, Ide believed, were the ones who maintained a kind of running accounting in their own minds, a continuous tracking of their decisions and the conditions that those decisions were creating, rather than simply responding to whatever the trail presented each morning. They were thinking ahead, not just reacting. And they were honest with themselves, privately if not always publicly, about the relationship between their choices and their consequences. This was difficult. It required a kind of self-scrutiny that was uncomfortable, particularly for men who had been elected on the basis of their apparent confidence and competence. To sit quietly at the edge of camp in the early morning and ask oneself with genuine rigor whether yesterday's decision had been the right one, whether the current trajectory of the party was actually sound, whether the information one had been relying on was actually reliable. This was not the work of the confident frontiersmen that the emigrants had voted for. It was quieter, harder, and less visible work than that, but it was the work that the trail actually required. The captains who brought their parties through intact, whose names appear in emigrant journals with consistent respect and gratitude, rather than the careful diplomatic neutrality that emigrants used when they did not want to record their resentment for posterity. These men shared a set of qualities that is worth dwelling on. They were not uniformly liked. Several of them were specifically described as difficult, demanding, or humorless. One captain who guided multiple parties successfully over the course of a decade was described by an emigrant woman as having no conversation and very little warmth, but an absolute certainty about everything that actually mattered. She meant this as something between a criticism and a compliment. What these successful captains shared was not charisma. It was not physical courage, though most of them had it. It was not even experience, though experience helped if it was the right kind of experience, the kind that had been processed and understood rather than merely accumulated. It was a specific form of honesty, an honesty directed primarily not at the emigrants but at the trail itself. The trail had its own nautic, its own demands, its own unforgiving arithmetic of grass and water and time and animal capacity. That arithmetic did not care about what the captain had promised. It did not care about the expectations of the families who had paid for their passage. It did not care about what had worked on previous journeys if this journey's conditions were different. It simply was what it was, and it responded to accurate assessment and appropriate action, and to nothing else. The successful captains read that arithmetic correctly, or corrected it quickly when they read it wrong, and they let their decisions be governed by it, rather than by what they wanted to be true or what they had told people would happen. This is not a glamorous quality. It does not make for a satisfying portrait of frontier heroism. But it is the quality that kept people alive, and that is, in the end, the only measure that the trail applied. There's a broader lesson here that extends well beyond a specific context of 19th century overland travel, though the specificity of that context is what makes the lesson visible. Every significant undertaking involves a gap between the plan and the reality. Every complex endeavor produces information as it proceeds that was not available at the outset. The question that leadership always answers, in every context and every century, is what that new information is used for. It can be used to adjust the plan, to correct the course, to acknowledge, privately or publicly, that the original assessment was incomplete and that the new information changes what should be done. This is painful. It invites the question of why the original assessment was wrong. It creates uncertainty in the people who have been following the plan. It requires the leader to accept a diminishment of the particular kind of authority that is based on appearing to have always known what was happening, or it can be set aside, explained away, attributed to circumstances rather than to judgment, used to construct a narrative in which the plan was always right. The original assessment was always sound, and the present difficulties are temporary and external rather than consequential and self-generated. The trail made the cost of the second choice visible because the trail's feedback was unambiguous and the timelines were compressed. A family that buried a child in the Nebraska sand had no interest in the captain's explanation of why it was not his fault. The ground made its own argument. Most human endeavors operate with softer feedback and longer timelines. The costs of the second choice are real, but they accumulate slowly, and they are easy to mistake for something else. The habit of choosing comfortable information over accurate information, of maintaining the plan against the evidence, rather than adjusting the evidence against the plan, costs most leaders most of what they could have achieved, but it costs them gradually, and quietly, and in ways that look on the surface like nothing more than ordinary difficulty. The frontier stripped away the softness. It made the question of whether a man was using accurate information or comfortable information a matter of life and death, visible within weeks rather than decades. That is the reason the study of it retains its usefulness, long after the trails themselves have been paved and the wagons have become museum pieces. There is a final quality worth noting in the captains who failed, because it is perhaps the most human of all the failure patterns, and perhaps the hardest to recognize in oneself. Most of them, even the ones whose decisions led to genuine disaster, were doing what they believed was right. They were not reckless for the pleasure of recklessness. They were not dishonest for the pleasure of dishonesty. They were men who had accepted a serious responsibility, who cared about the outcome, who were trying, within the limits of their understanding and their psychology, to lead their parties to safety. The failures were not failures of will. They were failures of perception. The ability to see oneself clearly enough to know when one's confidence has exceeded one's information. The ability to distinguish between the discomfort of being wrong and the genuine inadvisability of the path being questioned. The ability to receive, from the terrain or from other people or from one's own running accounting of decisions and consequences, the information that confidence and investment in a plan make it so easy not to hear. This is not a skill that announces itself. A man who possesses it does not feel particularly humble. He does not feel particularly uncertain. He feels, rather, like a man who is paying careful attention to what is actually happening and making his decisions accordingly. That quality, that sustained, disciplined, ego-resistant attention to reality, may be the most practical piece of wisdom that the overland trail, in all its harshness, has left behind. It required nothing supernatural. It required no unusual courage. It required only the willingness to let what was true be more important than what was comfortable. The morning is quiet out here, if you are willing to sit still long enough to hear it. The grass bends, the oxen breathe, and somewhere at the edge of the firelight, a man is deciding whether he will listen to what the land is telling him, or only to what he had already decided to believe. That decision was made 1,000 times, on 1,000 mornings, across 30 years of overland travel. The graves along the trail are, in many cases, its answer. The ones who made it home left behind a different kind of record. Quieter, less dramatic. The record of people who arrived,